My hope for tonight's lecture is that you walk away having learned never to give up. Never to give up on our children, never to give up on our delinquents, never to give up on our brothers and sisters, and most importantly, never to give up on yourself. This is the first time that I've been home since my arrest. And yes, I said home. For those of you who don't know my story, I actually grew up in that small one-stoplight town down the road called Herein, Indiana. The last time that I stood on this land as a free man, I was 15 years old, high on cocaine and pistol whipping somebody in a rage as I sought revenge. I spent 12 years within the Indiana Department of Corrections before being allowed out on house arrest, GPS ankle-monitored house arrest, which is the level of confinement that I currently reside on. Although you can't see it, I have this fancy bracelet, and I had to get permission to come here tonight. At 14, just stepping back from what I did when I was 15, I spent a year in Indiana boys' school for 2 pistol charges. At 13, it was marijuana. At 12, I burglarized a gas station. At 10, it was criminal mischief. At 9 years old, my first arrest came for burglary once again. And my first encounter with law enforcement was at 6 years old when I was picked up for a curfew violation. And those are just the things that are in the record. In between those convictions, there was an ungodly amount of criminal misconduct. Much of that I admitted to upon sentencing as a means to clear my conscience and also in hopes of receiving a lighter sentence. It was for the heinousness of my crimes as well as the criminal misconduct of my past criminal history that earned me a 36-year sentence in the Indiana Department of Corrections. I was handed that sentence at 16 years old. At the age of 16, I was shipped off to the Indiana Department of Corrections. I was sent to a maximum security adult prison in southern Indiana. I was initially sent there because it was the prison that housed the juvenile unit for kids who are waived into the adult system. I remained there, however, after I turned 18 because of the length of my sentence. You see, in Indiana, if you have 10 or more years, it is mandatory that you be kept in a maximum security prison. So at the age of 18, I walked over into the general population of a maximum security prison. And I spent 8 years in that prison before my security level dropped. 8 years living with the worst criminals that this state has ever seen. Crime so tragic that I would rather the memory of them die in my head than to share the details of what some of these men did. The stories that you don't hear because the media finds them too heinous to relate. I ate breakfast with serial killers and violent sexual predators at 18 years old. I watched as armed conflict unfolded before my eyes. Once I had to listen to my neighbor being repeatedly stabbed by his cellmate as he begged for his life. I watched as most young men entered the prison system, whether they had been waived or simply committed their crime at 18, 19, 20. I watched as they entered and were swallowed by the prison culture. I watched these men not even struggle as they gave in to the pressures of the social norms that exist within our Indiana prisons. On nights when the pain became unbearable, I remember laying in my cell in anguish. I'd say the Lord's Prayer to myself, quietly sobbing so as not to alarm my cellie, and I'd ask God to take me in my sleep. I suffered beyond sorrow because I consciously resisted the temptation of the world that I lived in. The temptation that came to me in every sight, sound, feeling. Every one of my senses was bombarded on a daily basis by a world that I rejected, a criminal world. And I often wondered, how in the hell did I make it to a place like that? You know, when I was just a kid, probably 6 years old, I'd say I had probably an abnormal childhood, but not in an alarming way. My favorite thing was to get up, 6 years old, and I'd run down to the local park. We were living in Lowell, Indiana. There's a park there called Evergreen Park. It had this nice little pond. And so I'd run down there, or I'd ride my little bike, and I'd troll the shores and the pavilion. And, I'd walk along the trees until I found some line that someone had abandoned, snagged in a tree. And with the dexterity that only a child has, I'd shimmy up it and get out there on a limb like a squirrel and yank it down. Then I'd roll some trash cans, flip some rocks to get bait, and I would just spend my day hand-lining bluegill until the streetlights came on, and sometimes even past that. But that was the joy of my childhood. I remember getting my first job, 6 years old. Now, rather, my father got a job, and it just happened to be 2 blocks up the street at a local car wash. You know, the kind where one attendant sort of runs the whole thing. So every morning, again, I'd get on my bike and I'd pedal up there 2 blocks, be there in no time. And my father taught me how to do everything. And one thing my father always taught me is that I could do anything in the world that I wanted. Anything. And so as a child, I did everything that I wanted to do, whatever it was. I developed a confidence and willpower far beyond my years. It was unfortunate, though, that at that age, running around town and hanging out at the park, that I began to idolize delinquents. Who else hangs out at the park all day with their friends, just sort of, moseying around. It was at that point that I felt myself sort of living 2 different lives. One life was what I lived at home, and the other was what I lived on the street. Being very good at acting, very good at lying, very good at manipulation, even at that age. Being a rather perceptive child, I quickly realized the contradiction that people live their lives in. They say one thing and they do another. They do one thing and they say another. They say this is what I'm about, and this is what they really live. A lot of times they go in different directions. And so I've seen that. What it said to me was, it's okay to live this way. It's okay to do the wrong thing and still say that you're doing the right thing, so long as no one notices, so long as you're not getting caught. It's okay to live 2 different lives, one out in the street with your friends, being a delinquent, and the other at home, doing chores, mowing the lawn, whatever it may have been. But that's just what life was. However, that came to an end upon my first arrest. At 9 years old, when the police escorted me out of my 3rd grade classroom, it was impossible for me to separate the 2 any longer. I remember returning to school, and my reputation was cemented at 9 years old. I vaguely recall several kids saying something like, My mom said, I can't play with you. You're a bad kid. Of course, I mean, if I said anything at all, it was probably just a brush off. But those things, they hurt. They hurt a lot. It was no fault of anyone's, no fault of the kids or their parents that said that. I mean, in some sense, a lot of you might even say that was appropriate. But it hurt, and it really cemented my trajectory going forward. You see, my status as an outlier would only increase over the years. And I really began to feel that separation seed inside me. It was a loneliness. Not your average loneliness of like you just being alone. It's that terrible feeling of being in a crowd of people, walking and talking all around you, but feeling completely alone. That kind of loneliness. That feeling took the recreational drug use that I had picked up hanging out with delinquents, and it took it as a crutch. Took it as self-medication to sort of try and repress those feelings. Because as a child, I didn't know how to deal with them. I had anybody to go to who could adequately explain to me how to deal with them. That's part of being alone, or feeling alone. You don't think anyone else knows what you're going through, or knows how you feel. I was lost. And I took that burden on my shoulders. Despite all those struggles, I can honestly say that I believe my spiral began when I discovered residential burglary, breaking into homes. The first home I broke into has left me with a memory that I have yet to live down. My friend broken into a man's home in the middle of the night. There I was, standing in his foyer, 14 years old, staring at his Purple Heart, tongue right next to me. It had arrested my movement down the hallway. I just stared at him, hearing my friend rummaging around in the back. I don't remember thinking anything, but just held me there. And as I broke away from it, something broke away from me. As if a levee broke and drowned in shame. From that point on, it went downhill very fast. I came away from that home with a lot of money and a lot of guns. I began getting high, real high. I began selling drugs, drinking, carrying a gun. Before that point, when people would act or say that I was a bad kid or a bad guy, I didn't agree with them. I didn't feel that in my heart. And on the other side, when my friends would sort of affirm me for being a bad guy or a delinquent or whatever it was, we were out vandalizing. At the same time, I didn't feel that. I didn't feel it in my heart. I felt almost like an imposter. Like, oh man, you're the man, you're the guy. Just an act. I don't feel it. When I started getting money, robbing houses, started selling drugs, started carrying around a gun, thinking I was a tough guy, I was finally able to embrace that act. Suddenly I sunk into it. And I said, yeah, you know what? This is really what a bad guy does. Sells drugs, gets high, carries guns. I guess this is just who I am. I found myself in the wrong way. I found myself in the wrong direction. And then I felt it in my heart. I felt all those repressed feelings begin to sink in and eat at me. I wasn't acting out of a conscious malice towards others. Rather, I was trying to fulfill a reputation. It didn't take me long to reach the low of robbing and pistol whipping a man. That happened at 14. I got that low at 15. It's within a year. But even at 15, being in and out of the juvenile detention center, I never considered that I'd be waived to adult court. Never something that crossed my mind. Not after the burglaries, not after the guns, not after this heinous act. It completely blindsided me when it was suggested. Sure, you may say, well, it's the law. I mean, how didn't you know that? But to be honest, I mean, most juveniles are completely ignorant of the law. Juvenile law, the adult law. Now, sure, given they do know, in some sense, right from wrong. So you could say, like, you knew that it was wrong, and certainly I did. Underneath all the drugs and the pain and the oppression and the years of habitual misconduct, I certainly did. But juveniles, in my experience, of their criminal conduct, being incarcerated with them, what they and we and I often think is what happened yesterday is going to happen again tomorrow. And so if I got arrested last month and I was sat down for a week or two, if I commit another crime, I'll be sat down for another week or two, or maybe, a month, or whatever it may be. I mean, a juvenile's mind is not thinking, about years. It's not thinking about prison. Why would it? Especially one who is trying to shore up their identity as a delinquent. As you know, delinquents, they are trying to affirm themselves and their reputations in that path habitually. Upon waiver, however, the entire dynamic inverts. Where you were once a juvenile, you didn't know the laws, everything was pretty much handled for you. It's flipped on its head. The juvenile system, the juvenile faces a maximum of a sentence up to their 21st birthday. So depending on what age you commit the crime, maybe that's a maximum of 8 years, probably less than that. But in one decision, in one waiver process, that sentence that may have been a maximum of 8 years is suddenly reclassed, and the juvenile is exposed of a sentence that ranges all the way up to life. In one hearing in the juvenile system, the juvenile waiver hearing. And it is my opinion, the opinion of my organization, that the juvenile waiver process is nowhere near robust enough to adequately represent the rights of a juvenile when the reclass of such risk is involved. I was nowhere near prepared to face the time that I faced. And to be honest, I had no idea what type of time I faced until just after the waiver hearing, which I wasn't allowed to attend. But after they shackled me and put me in the visitation room awaiting transfer to the county jail, my public defender walked in the door, and first time I'd ever heard mandatory minimum. She said, "Yeah, Miles, well, I'm looking at some of these felonies, an A, 3 Bs, just a whole script of things that I had done wrong. She said, well, in the first one, it's a mandatory minimum of 25, and the next one is 6, and you got 3 of those, and so that's 6, 6, 6, and well, Miles, it's not looking good for you. I said, well, what do you mean, a mandatory minimum? She said, well, if you're convicted of this, that's the least amount of time you could do. What? It's devastating, even at the prospect. If you can imagine, when I was given 36 years, it broke me instantly. I was 16 years old. That was longer than I had been alive. I couldn't wrap my head around that. In essence, that was a life sentence. 36 years to a 16-year-old. What does that even mean? Right then and there, I knew that life would never be the same. I was locked in a cell, alone, with no chance of regaining the life that I had. It's probably a good thing. I was left to recreate myself. I had to become someone new. When arriving in prison, I faced a bleak reality. Even that juvenile unit. Many of the teens alongside me were undergoing a similar transition. They were also trying to find new selves, recreating themselves. As you might imagine, get a sentence like that, like I said, there's no going back. You're in a completely new world. Nobody knows you. Anything you did, good or bad, doesn't matter anymore. Nothing. You arrive in prison with nothing. Period. Rock bottom. 36 feet below rock bottom. Now, unfortunately, most of those other juveniles are recreating themselves to fit the prisoner stereotype. Everything you've ever heard about prison on TV, in books, crime shows, all those ideas create a pressure in the back of your mind, and especially the juvenile's mind when in prison. And it goes to malform the identity that is being reformed as these juveniles prepare themselves for the rigors of adult prison. The day before my 18th birthday, I was sent over to the adult side. Now, initially, I got a job instantly. They seen how good of a worker I was, so they lined it up. You know, they really did me good. After working that job for probably 5 months, I got fired. You know, my productivity wasn't up, so they fired me. No harm, no foul. I didn't even know what that meant. You know, what did that mean for me in my life? Such a simple, innocuous thing as being fired from a job. When the Department of Corrections, that means that you go on idle for 90 days. It's mandatory. So, okay, I'm on idle. They said, well, no, you can't stay here anymore. This is a working cell house. Everyone here has a job. So you're going to an idle cell house. I said, okay, well, what's that mean? Well, I soon found out. Everyone in this cell house, 100 people that you live with, none of them work. And the majority of them don't work because they don't wish to. Their idea of prison is sitting around, playing cards, gambling, getting high, fighting, getting tattoos, exercising, and gang politicking. That is how they live their life. So suddenly, for losing a job at 18, I was thrust into it. And that was my real introduction to what prison was like. Everything was run by gangs. What phone you used, what table you sat at, what shower you were going to use, whether or not you got in the front of the line to get your dinner. It was all dictated by what gang you were involved in. And if you weren't involved in a gang, like myself, then you got the worst of all options. Always. That was just the order. That's not something you question. That's just in stone. And then it only got worse for me. But another juvenile I had known moved onto the block. He was about the same age as me. We were both 18, 19 years old. Him and I had some words on the juvenile block. And at the time, they really didn't mean anything. You argue. But now, in a maximum security prison, people don't argue. That's not a thing. People don't get loud. They go to violence immediately. And so out of fear that he was going to spread a rumor about our argument to try and make himself look tough, I immediately saw conflict with him. So that night, I went into his cell, and him and I fought. And unfortunately, I won. And just to give you an insight about really what type of place these are, as I exited the cell, 2 men rushed in and robbed him for everything that he had, just because they seen that he was in a weakened state. Just like that. You lose a fight, you just lost everything in a place like this. That's how they play in Indiana maximum security prisons. That is really what prison is like. The only way he could have recovered socially, or anybody in his position could have recovered, would have been to come stab one of us. That was it. You're put in that situation, and you lose a fight, you become robbed. For you to recover, you must go to some extreme. Now, thankfully, he was courageous enough not to stoop to that low. He reported us to the officer. We were all written up and moved. Now I was to a disciplinary item door. Now, this is where people would go when they were written up. It was sort of the last stop before segregation, isolated segregation. We were locked in our cells for 23 hours out of the day. We got 1 hour out. And the only difference was that for our 1 hour, we got to share it with 21 other badly behaving inmates. Believe me when I tell you that I had rather stayed in my cell for that hour, 24 hours around the clock, than go out there and mingle with them and socialize and tell stories and talk. And so that's what I did. I stayed in my cell. And at one point, I wrote the words of Dante across my cell door in 4-inch Italian. They appear in the Inferno, in the Canto 3. And they are what Dante says is written above the gates of hell. It says, "Through me you enter into the city of sorrow. Through me you find eternal pain. Through me you find the lost people." And in my mind, that cell door transformed into Hell's Gate. And I refused entry. I refused to go into the day room where there was nothing but chaos and violence. And so I turned my sight within to illuminate whatever dark corners I may have had. I turned myself to books to educate. Staring out of that cell door over the day room, I was confronted with the full depravity of humankind. In some sense, I wish you guys knew what that meant. I wish you could see it. I wish you could feel what that sentence means to me, because then you would know. I never sought another fight after that first one. I learned my lesson very quick. That's where it put me. Wasn't going to do that again. Unfortunately, I probably averaged 1 fight a year because I refused to be victimized. Because as soon as you let someone victimize you once, it's like blood in the water, and it will never stop. It pushes you to extremes that you would wish never to be to. I went from a childhood of stealing, lying, breaking into places, and at the height, assaulting somebody with a handgun. I went from that to living in hell on earth. And I arrived there at 18 years old. Although I was required to stay in that cell house only 6 months, it took me 2 years to get out of it because it was like a trap. Once you're there, they just don't move you out. They just keep you there. You get that reputation, oh, you're from G cell house. No, we don't want you. In 2 years, I almost lost my life in 2 different ways, both literally and figuratively. And on several occasions, as I just tried to get by, to keep my head down and stay to myself. The value of human life is discounted. It's discounted as men speak about murder as if it were golf. It's discounted as you watch people in armed conflict, just on random days. It's discounted when the guards abuse their authority over you to treat you like an animal. Now, I'll admit, when I did finally get out of that cell house, things did get better.
Check, check.
It's not to say that, all prison is completely bad. Rather, the point there was how easy it is to find yourself in a place that is hell on earth, in hell on earth. Life got a lot better when I got into a program unit. Thought of dying or killing in the name of self-defense became a less frequent occurrence. I was asked to be a leader in a community to teach leadership courses. I was 23, the youngest person ever to be asked to take on that role. I was hired in the law library, where I was able to act as a legal advocate for people. My legal career was met with a lot of success. I was successfully awarded federal injunctions fighting for the medical rights of prisoners, arguing that the staff were abusing the sick and elderly. And I did everything else from driving records to child support, just sort of your all-around experience. But it felt good. I had spent so much time in a cell reading, simply stuck in my head, that finally I was finding an anchor into the world around me, even if it was just a small world. And then, just when I felt like I was getting some stability in my life, came time to transfer prisons again. Now I was being transferred to a medium security prison, Westfield Prison, just east of here. Some of you might know it. Once again, my identity was stripped. I arrived at Westfield Prison with nothing. Everything I had done before, the leadership classes, working in the law library, meant nothing at all. There was no bridge between the two systems. I was simply just plucked out of one and thrown into the next. And so, of course, I landed immediately on the disciplinary side of that prison by default, for no reason at all. They just had an empty bed. They just throw you there. Who cares?
You would think that going to a lower level security prison would be a good thing. However, I imagine most of you have never been to Westville Prison. It is a ghetto behind fences. It is a place where drug use, drug sales are rampant, almost used in the open. It is the prison that the citizens from our region go to if they're sentenced to less than 10 years. Being a medium security prison, it is 10 to 5. It's the range. So even had I been a juvenile waived to adult court, given 10 years, that's where I would have went to. Excuse me. Threat of death really doesn't exist there. Great thing. On the flip side, something that I recognized immediately in maximum security prison is that the threat of death keeps people generally respectful, keeps a lot of people in line. You walk with attention because you know it's always at risk. In medium security prison, nobody is thinking about dying, I assure you. Very rarely anyway. And so chaos emerges. Violence through the roof. Fights every day. Like nothing. Like bread and water. It's a whole other feeling when you struggle because you're fighting for your life. At Westville, I struggled because everybody wanted to fight over who's next in the shower line, or what's going to be played on the TV in the day room, or, who's next on the kiosk. The senselessness of such a chaos, when you're forced to live it every day, immediately goes to undermine your integrity, your morals, any sense of wholeness that you have. Because suddenly your life has been reduced to those sorts of things, fighting over emails and phones and TV channels every day. And even if you're not in the fight, that's all you do is hear it. In an open dorm, there's people screaming about it. I underwent many of the same struggles. I was tempted by drugs. I was tempted by violence. People tried me. Starting all over again for no reason at all. I don't mean to shock you with this story, although I know likely that many of you would be surprised, because you do not know what is going on in our prisons. Prison to you is just a word, and maybe attached to that word is some idea of punishment. You lock a guy in a cell. He'll sit there for some years. He'll think about it. That would be a good thing for him. If that were just it, I would agree. But that's not the case. Our prisons are shut off from the world. They are enclosed. When tours go to inspect them, they operate the finest you've ever seen them on that day. This is the world that we are sending our citizens and our children into, whether it be a small sentence or a large sentence. These are the realities that they immediately face walking in the door on the first day. It is certainly a world of punishment. And for many, that may be pleasing. That's what you're supposed to go there for, to be punished. But it is also a world of corruption, a world of trauma, one where bad behaviors are taught and reinforced by the culture there. Against all odds, I succeeded. I became the person you see today. But make no mistake, I am an exception. I remain an outlier. The majority of our citizens do not fare nearly as well during their time of incarceration. Surviving that 12 years was a Herculean feat. Surviving it psychologically was a Herculean feat that many of our citizens do not rise to. They go, they become worse, they stay the same, maybe they give up crime, but there's no heart in it. They've simply just been beat down, beat by the time that they can't risk it anymore. But their hearts and minds were not transformed in the way that we would hope that our prisons would transform them, to recreate them into better citizens, productive citizens. I am a hard-on-crime advocate. I know what people are capable of. I know the beauty of human willpower. And so I expect a lot out of people. But I do not advocate for waving our children and sending them into a city of anguish so that they could live out their years fighting for their lives. Some things in life are terrible. Terrible in that way that you never want to do them again, right? And then some things in life are traumatic. Traumatic in the way that they scar the lens through which you see and perceive the world. And those scars stay. If prisons were really about correction, I would advocate for their liberal use. But correction takes instruction, and instruction takes teachers, classrooms, not cells. You want to punish someone? Give them a job. Make them learn something. Make them learn a trade. Don't just send them to prison where they're going to play cards, talk shit all day, watch TV, and just wait till they get back out. It's really not hard if you just give into it. My time was so hard because I fought it. Majority of those people, they just languished. They just laid around. They just didn't exist in our existence. And they just waited. Attacks on our society. My judge, the Honorable Judge Mary Harper, the most prestigious female judge in the state of Indiana, she was the longest standing, said that I was probably the worst juvenile case that she had ever encountered on her time on the bench. And I believe her. This is a woman's opinion that you can trust. Some 30 years watching cases come before her. But no matter the case, we should never give up on our children, even when they are the worst children you have ever seen. Because every child and every person has the divine gift of willpower, the ability to change, to recreate, to turn around, and to become something greater. Even the worst child you have ever seen. Do everything in your power as leaders, educators, and human healers to keep our citizens out of the Indiana Department of Corrections. Do everything you can to ensure that you use every resource available, and then find more to provide them before you ever consider thinking about sending them to hell on earth. Be considerate of those who are caught in vice. If not for the sake of the person, then for the sake of our society. The society that will see 95% of them return. You'll see these people again, 10 years. What will they be like? Will they be better for it? Will they be worse? What will we be like for it? In some sense, we have a duty to ourselves. Do not spite the wound because it infects the body, or you risk it spreading throughout the body politic like a cancer. Tend to the wound so that you may heal it, and that we may survive it better for its occurrence. With that said, I would like to leave you with a sonnet of mine titled Dues Due. The sun triumphs his place at peaking sign, as eyeing men disgorged from nights behind, ascend from earthly binds, restored to find there's work yet still to handle deeds unkind. Upright and bright, the serving soul does know that time is ink, a run against the thought of olden plans unbuilt, resulting woe, and against the truth unseen because it's unwrought. Unleash yourself from pain's serpentine lies. Escape the web of wicked wise that weigh us down in dark surprise, without allies, to catch us weak with no retreat as prey. My fellow friends in flesh, beset by vice, always afford the cost of being nice. Thank you. At this time, I'd like to open up the floor. Any questions, comments, criticisms, any inputs you might have or responses you might seek. Be more than happy to answer. Yes?
What level were you on?
Say that one more time.
What level were you on?
What do you mean, level?
Like, you go to prison, you got the first floor, second floor, then you got the high security at the top. Like when you would be dealing with like the cocaine dealers, the killers, all that.
Yeah, in prison, in the prisons that I was at, they didn't have a level system like that.
Oh, you didn't have the level system?
No, it was sides of the prison. So you had like the disciplinary side, the program side, the educational side, where you had disciplinary units, idle units.
I didn't know that.
Well, believe me, corrections differs around the nation quite dramatically. So it's easy to become confused.
I know who's on the level system.
Please, anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
How do you think like adults in your life could have supported you when you were a kid to like put you on a better path? What would it be like your parents and teachers?
How do I think the adults in my life could have supported me better, whether those would have been parents or teachers? Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, in hindsight, you can always say that somebody could have done something more, whether it been a teacher or a parent, or you could always say, oh, he was showing signs. Yeah, I mean, I'd hate to look back and say that, this person or that person should have done more. The fact is, we all do the most and the best that we can when we do it. It's like if you knew better, you would do better. If you could do more, then you would do it. Whatever you do in that moment is really what you could do in that moment. Whether or not because you were a procrastinator, or you were lazy, or you were having a bad day, or maybe you just didn't have enough money to do one thing or the other. So I really don't like looking back and pointing fingers to place blame on people. I mean, we all do the best that we can with what we have. And so, people can always do more. And I'll just leave that one at that. Thank you, though. Yeah, two in the back. Let me have you first.
Can you just tell us a little bit more about your organization?
Sure. So actually, it was recently formed. The website is not available yet because I'm still developing it, sort of trying to work that out. But basically, my organization seeks to educate the public on matters of criminal justice. So we go around speaking different conferences, whether they be classrooms or national conferences, trying to raise awareness of these issues. We've had some other presentations that were a bit more formal to sort of legislators and directors of programs recommending certain policy that we're trying to implement in every state. One of those policies is a mandatory checklist of regulations that a judge must go down during a waiver process. Things like psychological evaluation, a hybrid counsel system, social worker interviews with the victim, the family, both the perpetrator and the victim's family. These things they're not done, they're not required. Psychological evaluation, not required. You have a child who just committed a heinous crime. You're about to wave them into the adult system. You don't want to know what's going on in their head? Why not? So we think there are a number of things that should be mandatory, that it should be a little harder to waive a juvenile to the adult system. Not just for the sake of it, harder because we expect you to go through a few more stop checks, climb over a few more hurdles, just for the sake of the humanity of that child, seeing as how you're about to expose them to a life sentence in prison, something that is 6 or 7 times the length of life they've lived already.
For those who just got here, and I mean you, I'm kidding, grab 2 tickets of bingo in front, and then we'll get to our AGM set. Adarsha? Can you have him take 2 tickets of bingo? Cool.
Yeah. There was one more question over here. Could I get it? Yes, please.
I was wondering what kind of resources do you feel would be better to offer to children when they're in cycle of development?
Yeah, great question. So what resources do I think are best to offer to children who are caught in this cycle of delinquency? And this is actually something that I've thought a lot about. And I recommend big brother type programs. Now, the reason I recommend this is because they ask the child to get out and to go do things, to be active. And so the thing about a habit is that a habit is learned through physical activity. You actually do something, you become addicted to the habit, almost like smokers who just become addicted to putting something to their mouth. I was addicted to committing crimes because it was a certain behavior. Like I felt a draw to it just out of habit. And so to break that physical habit, I believe that you need a lot more than simply a mental exercise. So my big problem with a lot of the programs that I went through as a child, and don't get me wrong, they offered me a ton of programs. Counseling, community service, risk, PACT. I went through a lot. So I don't mean to take that away from them. But my big problem with it is that it was all verbal or thinking. You would sit in a room and you would do a workbook. And somehow that workbook was supposed to override these physical behaviors that I had taken on. And you understand, behaviors, it's neurology. These are neural pathways that have been ingrained in your mind. And they're almost like streams. If you have a fork in a river and one is larger than the other, the water is going to naturally fall through the larger channel. And it's the same thing, same way with your mind. You have channels, and the energy pushes through. And the larger one is your habit, and the energy naturally falls through it. And it is a real struggle to try and redirect the flow of that energy, especially simply by thought. So I recommend programs like Big Brother, just because they're going to get that child out of the house, out of whatever environment he or she may be in, and actually go do positive reinforcing things. And that could be as simple as going to the soup kitchen, sort of working up some compassion and empathy in the child to see this different way of life, to be grateful for his or her own life. So mostly things that are physical, I really put an emphasis on that just because it's going to be easier to overrun the physical habits that have laid into their mind. Yes, ma'am.
Usually at the age of 9 and having kids surrounded by you saying that you were a bad kid, not being accepted, that was a major factor of you doing this.
Sure. So, it was a factor, but do understand that I was sort of already, committing crimes, although they were minor, up until the age of 9. But it was when the police escorted me out of my classroom, my 3rd grade classroom, while class was in session. That moment truly cemented my reputation with my peers. And that was something that I could never recover from. Those people, God bless them, naturally could not view me in a new light. That's a traumatic thing. I probably would have reacted the same way had I been in their shoes. But certainly, it made me an outcast. It made me feel and think that I was the bad guy. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that discretion in that particular situation would have changed anything in the course of your life, in your experience?
Yeah, I definitely think that that they should use more discretion in that instance. Certainly, other than like a child possessing a gun in a classroom or fighting, I don't know what reason is so necessary that 2 police officers need to come into the classroom, send the principal, call the teacher. I think it went a little overboard. Again, not to blame people. Things just happen. In hindsight, we can all say and pick out the flaws. But certainly, if in your own experiences you ever come into a situation like that, don't send the police into the classroom. Yes, ma'am.
What was the most difficult part of re-entering into society, and what's your thoughts on the re-entry process in general?
That's a good question. Most difficult part. Probably realizing that I didn't know anybody. I remember getting out and started Facebook, just randomly adding people. Or they'd send me a friend request. All right, tons of them. And one day, my sister said, Miles, who are all these strangers on your Facebook? So I thought about it later. When I had looked somebody up that I knew 12 years ago. suddenly I realized that they were a stranger too. That the memory I had of this person and the relationship that we had sort of stunted in my mind. It froze. I mean, it was still living. I still had all these memories playing out. But then when I tried to look at them through the lens of those memories, they were completely different. 12 years, people got married, had kids, moved away, died. And so suddenly, I was just swept with this feeling of loss as I realized that everyone was a stranger. And I said, thank God I didn't start off adding all those people. That would have really felt bad. Much better to be around strangers you know are strangers. So for me, that was the hardest thing. It'll differ for everyone, really. In many respects, I sort of prepared myself for release in ways that others didn't. So that was my biggest struggle. For many people, though, if I might comment on it, it's going to be economics. It's going to be finding a job, going through that process, getting a car. That's a big thing, especially if you need a job. So just making sure that they are economically prepared to face the world. I was fortunate enough to get into a work release facility before I got out. So I was able to save up some money. And that was really a blessing. I really advocate for work release facilities, things that are in between like that, where people work real jobs, they make real money, they're forced to save it so that they can then support themselves upon getting out. Ma'am in the back, you had a question? Oh, okay, thank you. Yes.
Before you got your sentence when you were 16, did you see a different path for yourself in the crime or prison?
Yeah, believe it or not, and you could probably just lend this to the stupidity of delinquency or even being young. I never saw myself going to prison. Never. I just, it's funny. I have a memory. I was sitting in a program called risk management, still run today down at Porter Stark. It's like the last step before boys' school, which is like prison for juveniles. There was a workbook. We were doing a workbook, and they said, where do you see yourself in 1 year? I wrote it down. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Okay, 10, 25. And I remember working it out. I'm going to be a homeowner. I'm going to have a wife. Have some kids. Never did I think that I'd be in prison. I didn't even think that far ahead. And when I was forced to sit down and think about it, I just had to lie to myself, I guess. Because I was being honest with myself, but I wasn't being honest with myself. If that makes sense. Crazy dynamic that goes through your mind. Yes, ma'am.
So as far as mandatory and discretionary waivers go, I know the age minimums vary. So for the offense of murder, it's as young as 10 years old for the age minimum. Do you think that type of offense that's that severe should be eliminated completely as well?
Yeah, any 10-year-old that commits murder, I believe, should remain within the juvenile system and be given as much treatment as we have. They have juvenile facilities here in Indiana that have historically accepted juveniles with murder charges. So it's not like it can't be done. The question is, why isn't it being done more? And now all cases will vary. Certainly, I'd say if they're 10 years old, we save them all. There will be some kids that 14, 15, and 16, the heinousness of their crime, how it was committed, the process they went through might betray something seriously disturbing, in which case, I'm not completely against waivers. That's not my position. I just wish that we would respect the rights of a juvenile more, that we would have mandatory stop checks, that a psychological evaluation would be done every time a juvenile is waived, so that we have a better understanding of what's really going on here. Yes, ma'am.
What other options do you suggest instead of waiver? So say you do your stop checks and like, what is the goal with those stop checks? Like, as
Sure.
opposed to just saying, okay, there's waiver or nothing else. What are your other options?
So in the waiver hearing, what's being decided is whether or not to keep that juvenile in the juvenile system. Now, obviously, there's a lot more treatment in the juvenile system. However, when you have a child up against waiver, a lot of times it's because of a serious crime. Maybe it's murder, maybe it's robbery with a deadly weapon, but it's serious. So, I'm not, and you're not suggesting that you don't waive the child and you let them back out, or you give them a week or two. That's not what I'm suggesting. In Indiana, there are long-term juvenile treatment facilities, private-run facilities, not the Indiana Department of Corrections, that you could send these children to. They are facilities that have an abundance of different treatment options and methods. There are facilities that you can stay in for multiple years. So rather than waiving all but the worst, see, shouldn't even have said that, the worst. All but waiving all of them. See, I'm caught up. I believe that you should send the children to long-term juvenile treatment facilities unless you truly find some case that is just extremely disturbing and it is a behavior that you cannot risk putting around another child. You almost got it. Is there anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
You talked about prisons being like really isolated from the rest of the world. Do you have any ideas for like how to make that less isolated?
Yeah, absolutely. So my mission in life is to build the most humane prison in the world. Now that's a lecture for another time, but it's something that I've been developing for the last 6 years. It's based on a nonprofit model, and I plan to build it somewhere here in America. And I'm actually seeking an architect right now to build the plans with me so that I can then start going to the state houses all around the nation and proposing it. So I definitely believe that there is a far better way to treat people once they are incarcerated. As I said, punishment shouldn't just be lock them in a cell, let them watch TV all day. Part of my prison is labor. I want you to work, and I'm not just going to slave you away. I'm going to teach you a trade. I'm going to teach you a profession. I'm going to teach you something that makes you feel respectable. In my opinion, it's the great problem of our age, that prisons are sort of the cancer in our body politic, and they are allowed to fester. We keep sending more people there, and it just keeps putting it back out. And these people come out, and their fathers and their mothers, and they're addicted. And they still have these same bad behaviors or attitudes, whatever it may be. And right there in that prison, it's just a cycle. It heals people, it really just beats them down. So I believe in changing prisons across the nation in hopes of healing society. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
What was the great moment that broke the cycle for you?
36 years. Yep. That's when I realized, not to be crude, but it wasn't a joke anymore. And I had started to realize it even before then, upon being waived and being told, this is what you now face. These are the stakes that you're playing with. The game changed immediately, but it changed past the point of no return. Had I known that I was going to be waived, if they said, the next crime you commit, whatever it is, we're waiving you. This is what you face. See you later. I don't care if you jaywalk. Then I would have known. But as it was, as an ignorant, young, drug-addicted kid, all I could think about were, weeks in JDC, maybe a trip to boys' school. But when the stakes changed, and they were talking years, decades, that did it for me. But it was too late. And then finally, when I got that unexpected sentence of 36 years, and I was sent to prison, As I said, I was stripped of everything. I had to recreate myself. And it was in that moment that I knew that I was going to become something. My worst fear was becoming nothing. If you do nothing, you become nothing. And I wasn't going to do that. So I tried like hell.